were to step back in time to London 1940, despite the fact you'd still be able to pick out the great familiar landmarks such as Buckingham Palace, St Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, wonderful green parks and open spaces. You'd also find a city, and, for that matter, an entire nation under siege. This was the year that brought home to the people of Great Britain the real impact of a world at war, on this occasion for the second time in the 20th century. Even before war broke out, albeit only by 2 days, a blackout was imposed, which meant that as darkness fell, all the lights were quite literally blacked out. Street lamps were switched off and all houses fitted with blackout curtains, and there were wardens to make sure not a chink of light appeared. The idea was to make life as difficult as possible for the German bombers to fight dark. However, for the people of Britain, there were problems. Traffic accidents increased as headlights were also blacked out. In fact, in the early stages of the war, more people were killed in accidents as a result of the blackout than were lost in enemy action. Country folk who had never had the luxury of street lighting fared much better than their town-dwelling counterparts. Towards the end of 1940, the blackout had little effect when it came to protecting the people of Britain and Londoners in particular. The Blitz was the term used for Adolf Hitler's bombing campaign, designed to break the morale of the British people and force them into submission. The attack was sustained night after night as people had to learn to live with the constant threat of death. As night fell, air raid sirens would sound as soon as the enemy aircraft were spotted, allowing people to take shelter. Many children had been evacuated from Britain's big cities to the safety of the countryside, but there were still some families who chose not to be split up. In London, thousands of folk sheltered in underground railway stations where a spirit of camaraderie developed that even the constant bombing couldn't break. Each night, the skyline of London was illuminated by explosions and fires, and each morning people would emerge to survey the damage. There was no distinction between rich and poor for the bombers. Buckingham Palace was damaged just like the thousands of East End slum houses that were hit. Some found their homes and possessions were nothing but a pile of rubble. Others lost loved ones, and many were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the gas masks which they carried at all times. The government had issued gas masks at the beginning of the war, expecting huge casualties as the result of poison gas. Children were issued with Mickey Mouse nicknamed gas masks in the hope that they wouldn't be afraid of the definitely alarming contraptions. Although when you think of the Blitz, London immediately springs to mind, many other cities were also badly damaged. In the campaign, Plymouth, Birmingham, Liverpool and Coventry all suffered, with Coventry in particular facing a devastating onslaught. On a cold and frosty night, the Germans targeted Coventry with the clear light of the moon to guide their way. It was an act of war that is still talked about by present-day inhabitants of Coventry. However, the numbers are ever decreasing of those who actually recount the story of that night from personal experience. And as time goes on, all that will be left is their recorded testimonies, a precious archive indeed for future generations. If the nights were terrifying, the days were also fraught with worry. All fit young men were called up to join the Army, Navy or Air Force. As the war continued, This included those men aged between 18 and 41, which left few on the home front, as British forces were sent to Europe, the Far East and Africa. Scientists and engineers were excluded from the draft, as their jobs were of vital importance to the war effort, and those not deemed fit enough for the forces often joined the Home Guard. Nicknamed Dad's Army, because of the advanced years of many of their members, they trained in preparation for an enemy invasion, something that they all took very seriously, despite being the good-humoured butt of many a wartime joke. With the men of Britain quite literally away for the duration, life for the nation's women changed very dramatically. As well as caring for and feeding their children, they worked in the factories, taking the men's places on the production lines, playing a vital role in the manufacture of munitions and vehicles for the troops. Farming was also of crucial importance if the people of Britain were to survive the war years, but with few men left to work the land, it fell to the women to step into the breach. The Land Army girls came from all walks of life, with hairdressers turning their hand to cultivating livestock and debutantes learning how to plough a field. Just as had happened with the men, as the war went on, women aged between 19 and 30 had to register for war work. Many joined the forces as non-competent secretaries, drivers, cooks, nurses and mechanics. Others joined the Women's Royal Voluntary Service, better known as the WRVS, providing meals and clothing for the survivors of the bombing raids and the rescue workers, and of course the Land Army and factory jobs also counted as war work. For a great number of people facing the horrors of war in their own homes, they'd already survived one world war that had been proclaimed the war to end all wars. The man responsible for making this statement had been the great British author H.G. Wells, who'd made many predictions about the future that would prove to be correct. However, on this occasion, very sadly for the sake of all humanity, his rhetoric about World War I was no more than wishful thinking. If the history of World War II has any lesson to lay down for future generations, the events that preceded Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's declaration of war with Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 are very telling. It's a journey that takes us right back to the end of World War I in 1918. A politically minded Austrian citizen who'd fought for the German army by the name of Adolf Hitler developed a very loud voice that he was determined the rest of the world would listen to, whether they liked it or not. There are many people who, with the great gift of hindsight, declare Adolf Hitler to have been a madman. And how right they are. However, the fact that he could be charming, eloquent and extremely persuasive made this fact very difficult to spot when he was rising to political power. And it's a salutary warning to every future generation that an excellent politician is not necessarily all that they might seem. Hitler was most dangerous because he was able to incite the people of Germany to follow him, democratically voting the dictator into high office. And he was able to do this by playing on the extreme sense of injustice felt by the nation after World War I. Born in what was in his day Austria-Hungary, on the 20th of April 1889, Adolf Hitler developed an anti-Semitic view even from his school days. And when he lost both his parents and found himself alone at the very impressionable age of 18, he moved to Vienna, where there was a large community of Jews. Unfortunately, young Adolf was not alone in his prejudice, as there were plenty of politicians, even the mayor of Vienna at the time, who incited public distrust of the Jews. Hitler didn't settle in Vienna for long, moving to Munich in Germany. And as the First World War broke out in 1914, he joined the Bavarian army, and throughout the conflict fought as a fierce German patriot, even being honoured with the Iron Cross for bravery. When armistice came in 1918 with the German surrender, Hitler, like many fellow patriots, refused to accept that the army had actually been defeated and blamed the country's politicians for capitulating. The victorious Allies were determined that Germany would pay for their aggression, and with the Treaty of Versailles imposed an enormous war debt, forcing Germany to admit sole responsibility for the conflict. Also, valuable industrial land was stripped from them, and the German military disbanded in every form, with all the armament factories being destroyed. For Adolf Hitler, the world of politics beckoned, and as it became evident that Germany would never be able to pay its war debt, and living conditions for ordinary Germans spiralled into terrible hardship, he and like-minded colleagues stepped forward to offer words of comfort. The nation wanted answers for their plight, and Hitler's political party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, had the perfect scapegoat for all their troubles: the Jews. Through the 1920s and 30s, Hitler climbed steadily to power, convincing the people of Germany that he would save their great nation and put the country back on the economic map. This made him extremely popular, especially as his secret state police, the Gestapo, were given free rein to silence dissenters. When, in 1935, all Jews lost their German citizenship under Hitler's new laws, few non-Jews protested. The rest of the world woke up to the danger of Adolf Hitler when he violated the Treaty of Versailles in spectacular fashion, building a huge military machine, conscripting the many millions of disgruntled German unemployed into his army. With uniforms, youth movements, drums to bang and flags to wave, it appeared as if national pride had been restored. Hitler also forged important alliances with the fascist dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, Japan, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria to form the Axis powers. Back in Britain, in 1937, a new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, took charge of the country from Stanley Baldwin, and right from the outset, Adolf Hitler was never far from his thoughts. After pledging to respect Austrian independence, Hitler seized the country of his birth early in 1938 and turned his attention towards Czechoslovakia, and when he pledged to respect their independence too, the Czech government knew there was trouble ahead. Chamberlain did his utmost to broker a peaceful settlement, even flying to Germany in the autumn of 1938 to meet Hitler. The people of Britain waited expectantly for Chamberlain's return. Crowds gathered at the airport to see him wave a peace pact signed by Hitler and Mussolini. War had been averted, quite literally at the 11th hour, and Chamberlain was given a hero's welcome, received by the King and Queen at Buckingham Palace and cheered by even bigger crowds outside number 10 Downing Street. Chamberlain proclaimed to the waiting nation and the rest of the world, "I believe it is peace in our time." On so many occasions already, Hitler had proved that he was a man not to be trusted, and by March 1939 he yet again went back on his word. Without any warning, the German army marched into Czechoslovakia, shattering any hope of peace, and to make matters worse, the Nazi war machine immediately set its sights on Poland. Chamberlain and the British government, along with the French, offered a guarantee of safety to Poland, seemingly secure in the knowledge that negotiations were underway with the Russians to form an alliance. But Adolf Hitler was one step ahead, and in August 1939 he secured a non-aggression pact with Russia, which left him a clear route into Poland. As far as Hitler was concerned, Britain and France hadn't stood up to him yet, and he believed that there would be no change now. After all, why would they go to war over Poland? There was no attempt to explore diplomatic avenues, and on the 1st of September 1939, the Nazis marched straight into Poland. To say that Adolf Hitler had his very own nemesis waiting in the wings in Britain perhaps sounds a little nebulous, but all through the appeasement process, one man had spoken out constantly of the real threat that Hitler posed. His name was Winston Churchill, a member of the British aristocracy as well as Parliament, and he was the surprise hero, well into his 60s, who would quite literally lead the people of Britain in their finest hour. When his pessimistic but realistic assessment of Adolf Hitler was proved correct, he took his place as the First Lord of the Admiralty, much to the comfort of the nation, as the fateful but expected news was announced. On Sunday, the 3rd of September, at 11:15 in the morning, the lawn mowers were silenced, the newspapers put to one side, and the children snatched from play as the entire population gathered around their wireless sets to hear the words of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. The storm clouds had been gathering for so long, this statement would have come as no surprise. Yet it was one of those historic moments that brought Britain to a standstill, as the full implications of what lay ahead had to be faced. As men joined the armed forces, families faced a new challenge that for city dwellers brought about a mass exodus of children to the countryside. In the first few weeks of the war, almost 2 million children were evacuated, being taken in by host families, although it wasn't quite as straightforward as the government would have liked people to believe. The clash between urban and rural cultures was understandably difficult for both the children and the hosts to deal with. Many inner-city children came from terrible poverty, suffering poor health, and even at this early stage in the war, it was clear that social conditions would need to be reviewed once the conflict was over. The terror of anticipation gave way to an uneasy calm through the remainder of 1939, and it was even dubbed the Phony War. Quite a significant number of children returned to their homes in the towns and cities which they'd only just left. But this was definitely the lull before the storm, and as Britain learned to cope with the introduction of food rationing in the January of 1940, Hitler continued to threaten Europe and Scandinavia. Despite his assurances to the contrary, Hitler invaded first Denmark and then Norway. The Norwegians fought fiercely, as had the people of Poland, to stem the tide of the Nazi advance, but to no avail. The German war machine thundered on relentlessly. Hitler's next move was the most audacious to date, as his Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, smashed through the defences of Belgium, Holland, and even France. For the people of Britain, the Nazis were getting much too close for comfort, and any thoughts of a phony war were long forgotten. However, a wartime spirit was developing in Britain that would give Adolf Hitler a more difficult time than he'd arrogantly anticipated. For starters, the now much maligned Neville Chamberlain was replaced by Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of a new all-party government. Confidence in his ability to lead the nation was infectious, and one of Churchill's first speeches that offered nothing but his blood, toil, tears and sweat inspired an expectant people. With Hitler storming through continental Europe, the British Expeditionary Force in France were in terrible trouble, and alongside the Belgian and French soldiers battled their way northwards, defeated and struggling with every step to escape the advancing German army. Once quiet French country roads were littered with the machinery of war. This was a military disaster beyond compare. Thousands of the Allies' finest troops were destined to lose their lives, and as they converged on the French harbour of Dunkirk, the chances of being rescued from Hitler's devastating panzer divisions were getting slimmer by the hour. Back in Britain, the Admiralty prepared to send destroyers and transport ships, but considering the shallow waters along this stretch of coastline and the tide patterns, the most they could hope to rescue would be 30,000, leaving almost 1/3 men at the mercy of the Germans. This was undoubtedly the darkest moment yet for the British and Allied forces, but the intangible power of wartime Britain's indomitable spirit had not yet come into play. All along the south coast of England, the call went out for civilian craft to accompany the Royal Naval ships, and the public response was phenomenal. There were rowing boats, yachts, fishing vessels, tugs, paddle steamers, and in fact, anybody who had a watertight craft that could get to France stepped forward to volunteer for king and country. Between the 27th of May and the 3rd of June 1940, the bravery and tenacity shown under extreme fire by military personnel and civilians alike brought about what can only be described as a miracle of deliverance, words that Winston Churchill chose with great care. The incredible result was that 226,000 British and 110,000 French troops were carried safely back to England, as the little boats ferried the men to the bigger ships, and even in some cases, all the way home. Not that there was ever any let-up from the Germans, who had the Allies on the run. Those who remained on the beaches to stem the tide of the advancing Nazi army faced certain death or capture, and the RAF battled furiously against Hitler's Luftwaffe to protect the exhausted soldiers on the open decks, who would otherwise have been sitting ducks. Dunkirk was a massive defeat. There's no question of that fact, and it highlighted just how vulnerable and unprepared the Allies were to face the Nazi war machine and Adolf Hitler's determination to achieve global domination. However, the forging of a fighting spirit in Britain and the occupied countries of Europe to resist their German conquerors would certainly be instrumental in the eventual demise of Adolf Hitler. There was also displayed here, for the Allies' military strategists, a chink in the Führer's armour that at least offered the most precious gift of hope when it had seemed so much would be lost. Hitler was so focused on advancing to take Paris, France's capital, he lost sight, albeit momentarily, of the bigger picture. This provided the Allies with a very brief window of opportunity, which is why the Great Escape from Dunkirk was possible. What happened next is very difficult for modern audiences to comprehend, but as Adolf Hitler planned to invade Britain, the threat of German occupation grew very real. Paris surrendered to the Germans on the 14th of June 1940. The following day, the British government announced that the Channel Islands would not be defended. By the end of the month, the German forces had occupied Guernsey, which was quickly followed by Jersey, Alderney and Sark. To this day, you'll still find reminders of the occupation along the now peaceful beaches of these beautiful islands. But back in 1940, for the people of Britain, the Nazi threat was far too close for comfort. If Adolf Hitler was going to successfully invade Britain, he first needed to eliminate the Royal Navy, a daunting task in itself. However, before such action could be taken, the RAF would have to be destroyed. This, according to the Luftwaffe, would be a much easier prospect. They truly believed the job would be done and dusted within 4 days, and the nation's aircraft industry would be out of action after just 4 weeks. Although there was a degree of arrogance on Hitler's part, on paper the RAF was considerably weaker than the Luftwaffe and distinctly lacking in trained pilots. Yet again, there was no allowance made for the great British spirit of the underdog that refused to be beaten. Also, they hadn't appreciated the power of the RAF's most precious weapon, radar, which, although in its early stages of development, allowed the British fighter pilots devastating accuracy. To get an idea of what life for the brave pilots and ground crew was like, a visit to the Aviation Heritage Centre can be very enlightening. This wonderful example in East Kirby in Lincolnshire really does take you back in time, and today we have the added bonus of observing a Spitfire in flight, a plane that was quite literally the epitome of the spirit of the Battle of Britain. Other aircraft played a vital role in World War II, including the Lancaster bomber, a fine specimen of which can also be found here at East Kirby. But it was the Spitfire that just the mention of boosted morale. At the outset of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe's concentrated attacks on the RAF's airfield and aircraft was very effective. And despite pilots from Allied nations arriving to boost numbers, casualties were high. It's interesting to note that despite America's late entry into the war, there was a band of remarkable American pilots who came to Britain anyway to lend their support, a contribution that was invaluable. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe's war of attrition was working, and whether propaganda after the event or gospel truth, it's been said that Hitler, unbeknownst to him, was only 24 hours away from victory. The RAF pilots were exhausted, but one of their number, in pursuit of a German bomber, chased his adversary over London, where the Luftwaffe pilot dropped his bombs. Winston Churchill immediately responded by ordering the bombing of German cities, believing it to have been a deliberate act of war against Britain's civilian population. Not to be outdone by Churchill's knee-jerk reaction, Hitler was equally enraged by his opposite number's attack on the fatherland, and ordered the Luftwaffe to redirect its campaign from the airfields of Britain to the beleaguered nation's cities. This was just the respite the RAF needed, and with characteristic resilience, trained new pilots and repaired their aircraft to thankfully fight another day. The Battle of Britain had been won by the RAF in the skies by the narrowest margin, and as the autumn leaves started to fall, Adolf Hitler had lost the opportunity to invade, as weather conditions and tide patterns turned against him. At this key point, Hitler, who had for the first time since he started his campaign of terror failed to gain the upper hand, needed to reconsider his strategy. For the time being, the British could keep their island, but he would make life as difficult as possible for them, blitzing the nation with nighttime bombing raids. If Hitler couldn't storm their green and pleasant land, he'd terrorise the people into submission by breaking their so-called wartime spirit. Hitler also looked to the east and began an onslaught on the Russian front, which would ironically meet with equally ferocious resistance. The idea of the Blitz was to force the British into a surrender, and although London definitely took the brunt of the Luftwaffe's relentless attacks, other cities also came under heavy fire. Coventry suffered utter devastation in the heart of the industrial Midlands, and the major south coast ports, including Portsmouth and Southampton, were strategic targets for the Germans. Plymouth was almost levelled to the ground, and many historic buildings were lost along with the men, women and children who died in the attacks. As autumn gave way to winter, Britain went into its first real Christmas at war, a real test for the morale of the people. Thousands of British servicemen had been killed, wounded or captured, and on the home front, many families had experienced the loss of friends or relations. Yet the nation had survived the Battle of Britain, and had Hitler had his way, the Third Reich would have already swallowed them up. So, despite the hardships, there was much to be thankful for. Although rations had become stricter, with bacon, butter, meat, sugar and tea in short supply, the tea ration was doubled for Christmas, and the quantity of sugar permitted increased. Non-rationed food was still available, with wines and spirits still quite plentiful, but at a price. Christmas gifts tended to be very practical, gardening tools and seeds being popular for a nation learning to dig for victory. But at the top of the 1940s must-have Christmas gift list was soap. There was a brief cessation of hostilities over the Christmas holiday, but as Big Ben rang in the new year of 1941, the people of Britain couldn't begin to imagine what the months ahead had in store for them, and whether they would even survive to see another Christmas and New Year. The early part of 1941 brought no let-up in Hitler's Blitz. By the time he scaled down the proceedings in May, as he deployed 2/3 of the German military machine on the Eastern Front, almost 1.5 million British people had been made homeless by the bombing, and 43,000 had actually lost their lives. The bombardment of British cities continued, as did the retaliatory strikes on the German people, but Hitler's sights were set on a much wider global objective. German forces arrived in North Africa and invaded Greece and Yugoslavia before Hitler's Operation Barbarossa saw the Nazis invade Russia. Like that other would-be ruler of the world, Napoleon, from a century and a half earlier, the first skirmishes went against the Russians, as Sebastopol fell and the Germans marched towards Moscow. History certainly repeated itself, however, as the Russian winter came in hard and fast, crippling the German advance, just as it had the French all those years earlier. Then, as people's minds turned towards another Christmas at war, the battle arena shifted to the Pacific as the Japanese decided to settle a few scores of their own. Early on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched a devastating attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It quite literally took the world unawares. The alliance formed by the Japanese with Adolf Hitler had inspired them to further incursions into China, and they then took French Indochina whilst posing a menacing threat to the British colonies in the Pacific. The Americans imposed oil embargoes in order to halt the advance of the Japanese, but this incited Japan to target the US Navy instead. While appearing to follow the diplomatic course, sending Japanese ambassadors to Washington, the strike force was dispatched in preparation for the attack on Pearl Harbor as global conflict became unavoidable. The United States were drawn into the conflict as Germany declared war on America. Japan invaded the Philippines, Burma and Hong Kong, with the fall of Singapore not long away, and the native people of the Pacific, along with the old colonials and Allied servicemen sent to protect them, experienced unimagined horrors at the hands of the occupying Japanese. For the people of Great Britain, the attack on Pearl Harbor might have seemed a million miles away, But the first direct result of this action was an influx of American servicemen, or GIs as they were more commonly known. A sense of optimism arrived with the young men, and for the young women of Britain, starved of male company for such a long time, the GIs, with their ready supplies of chocolate and nylon stockings, were extremely popular. Girls had resorted to having their legs painted with gravy browning and a line drawn up the back of their legs with an eyebrow pencil to give the effect of seamed stockings. For daytime, this was fine, but over-enthusiastic nighttime jitterbugging could give the game away. However, the British men left at home were far from enamoured with the glamorous American visitors, and the complaint went that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. As well as providing battalions of soldiers, airmen and sailors, the American government was able to replace the vehicles and munitions lost on the French roads on the way to escape at Dunkirk, putting the Allies back into World War II with a fighting chance. The British wartime spirit continued to stand firm in the face of privations and difficulties, and very slowly the news from overseas started to get better. In the Pacific, at the Battle of Midway, the USA turned the tide against the Japanese. And in North Africa, Britain's very own Field Marshal Montgomery, fondly known as Monty, took the initiative against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps at El Alamein, and the Russians valiantly counterattacked at Stalingrad. At last, Hitler was not having it all his own way, and when news reached the rest of the world about the terrible fate of the Jews in the Nazi concentration camps at places like Auschwitz, Dachau and Belsen, resolve hardened with pledges to avenge such horrendous crimes against humanity. As another year and war ended, and 1943 brought with it a promise of more of the same, Winston Churchill came into his own, keeping up Britain's morale with his fine speeches, supremely confident that right would prevail in the end. Elsewhere, the Russians were equally as focused, and in February 1943, the Germans were forced to surrender at Stalingrad, Hitler's first major defeat. However, in the Atlantic, the German U-boats were still winning the advantage at every turn. Then came a major breakthrough at Bletchley Park's top-secret communication headquarters, where the Enigma code was deciphered, allowing Allied shipping to predict accurately where the U-boats were going to strike next. Consequently, the battle for the Atlantic was all but over, and as spring gave way to summer, German and Italian forces surrendered to the Allies in North Africa. With strategic access to the Mediterranean from Tunisia, the Allies took Sicily and started to move up through Italy, but it was hard-fought progress which continued into the new year of 1944. Eventually, Rome was liberated on the 5th of June, but despite being a dramatic event, the newspapers of the world quickly carried a very different story. D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, has gone down in history as the beginning of the end of World War II. Sooner or later, the Allies would have to attack the German armies on mainland Europe, and after a great deal of planning, early June was selected when tide conditions were favourable. But things went far from smoothly. For months beforehand, the south coast of Britain had been transformed into an army camp as more than 3.5 million servicemen went into training for the big day. Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders and Allied forces from all over the world made ready to liberate the Nazi-occupied territories across the English Channel. The British have always been greatly mocked for being a nation obsessed with the weather, but in the June of 1944 there was definite cause for concern as storm force gales hit the Channel. The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, postponed the invasion from the 5th to the 6th of June because of the weather. But if the delay was to be any longer, it would literally be months before another attempt could be made. The armed forces were already aboard ship, and even though the weather was still atrocious, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead. If the D-Day invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, was to be successful, surprise would be the key element, and quite miraculously, 6,500 vessels transported 130,000 troops across the Channel on that stormy morning without the Germans knowing a thing about it. The RAF, notably Spitfires and Lancasters, kept the skies above clear as the Allied invasion force landed on the beaches of Normandy. German intelligence had confidently predicted that any invasion would come between Dover and Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. And although warnings had been given about a June invasion, they couldn't believe that anything would happen in such awful weather. So convinced were they that there was no immediate danger, Rommel, who was responsible for resisting any such invasion, went home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. It was a remarkable coup for Allied intelligence, although there was a worrying incident just days before the planned invasion. The Daily Telegraph crossword, a veritable British institution, had some very worrying answers through May and June. First, Utah appeared, the code name for one of the Normandy landing beaches, followed by Omaha, code name for the next of the landing beaches, quickly superseded by Overlord, the entire operation, and Mulberry, the code name for the artificial harbours that were to be built after the landings. Things were looking very suspicious. Finally, Neptune, which was the code for the naval part of the proceedings, appeared on the 2nd of June, just days before the planned invasion. Compiled by an English schoolmaster who knew nothing of any invasion plans or the significance of his choice of words, this strange phenomenon has been put down to coincidence, but it certainly gave MI5, Britain's spy agency, more than a few sleepless nights in the run-up to D-Day. Despite the discomfort of the journey, the first soldiers to land on Utah Beach had a very pleasant surprise, as, being slightly off course, they met little German resistance. Further down, on Omaha Beach, the same could not be said for the American forces that came ashore to sustain the heaviest casualties of the day. To complete the set, Gold, Juno and Sword beaches were taken by the rest of the Allies, and the push towards Paris and the French interior was well underway. It was only a relatively short distance in miles, but it took until August for the Allies to liberate Paris. But at last, Hitler's German army was on the run. Early in 1945, As the Allies were forging a path through Nazi-occupied Europe, the Russians were advancing on Berlin from the east. The people of Britain could only wait and hope for news that the war was over, as the Russians entered Berlin on the 21st of April with the Allies in hot pursuit. Holed up in his Berlin bunker, his dream of world domination in ruins, Adolf Hitler took his own life rather than face the consequences of his appalling actions. The war in Europe was over, and when news reached Britain, the celebrations were unparalleled. May the 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe, or VE Day, brought the entire population out onto the streets for a victory party that included everyone, from newborn babes in arms to the oldest citizens who'd never expected to live long enough to enjoy peace in their time. In London, the crowds flocked to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were joined by Winston Churchill to acknowledge the thanks of a grateful nation, and the carnival atmosphere lasted long into the night. One absentee from the celebrations was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, who'd worked so hard alongside Winston Churchill in the hope of overthrowing tyranny and Nazi domination. Sadly, he died in April 1945, so close to the end of the war, and yet so far away, that the dilemma left to his successor over how to end the war for once and for all was indeed a poisoned chalice. President Harry S. Truman had a terrible choice to make, because the Japanese, tenacious to the last, had their own battles still to fight. Preparations for an invasion of Japan were in place, but casualties would be devastating for the American and Allied forces charged with this daunting task. Conversely, Truman had the atomic bomb in his arsenal, and although never tried, it could swiftly destroy Japanese resistance. He chose the latter option, wiping Hiroshima off the face of the earth on the 6th of August 1945, and Nagasaki a matter of days later. It was all over. The Japanese surrendered on the 14th of August, and the Americans celebrated Victory in Japan, or VJ Day, with the same gusto as the British people had VE Day some months earlier. As Winston Churchill had so aptly put it, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The entire population of the world owed their freedom from Nazi oppression to those that gave their lives in the conflict that was World War II. Britain was indeed a changed nation, and there was a certain charming innocence lost forever. Servicemen returning from the war refused to accept unemployment and demanded social change. Churchill, so much the man of the moment during the war, and his Conservative Party were rejected in favour of Clement Attlee's Labour government. The new health service provided cradle-to-grave medical care, free to all at the point of delivery, and nationalisation flourished as Britain clawed its way back to economic stability. It took some years for the privations of war to be forgotten, particularly as rationing in the immediate aftermath of the war got worse before it got better, eventually coming to an end on the 4th of July 1954. Our generation has been fortunate enough to have heard first-hand accounts of what life in wartime Britain was really like, and there's one thing that is absolutely constant. The spirit that united Britain during World War II was truly great. People might have been hungry, but they didn't starve. They had very little in terms of possessions and security, but what they had was shared. And phrases like "make do and mend," "dig for victory," and "waste not, want not" became a code to live by rather than resented constraints. Winston Churchill was the voice of the country, and when he called upon the people of Britain to rally to the battle cry, they responded again and again. It was indeed a nation's finest hour.